Please, I welcome any questions from the audience. Yes, sir, down here, please.
Oh, thank you. Aubrey Chernick, I have a question for the Imam. So, as a Muslim, we understand that you regard the Quran as a perfect document. And I think one of the things that is an issue for many of us Christians and Jews in the audience are parts in the Quran that talk about how Jews are the descendants of animals and pigs, and how Muslims should look at Jews and kill them, etc. And so many of us on this side would say, it doesn't sound like a perfect document. So the question is, where do we go, since my understanding is you can't call for any changes to the Quran or these offensive phrases, and you can't even participate in a dialogue about whether we should or not. How do we get there? Because again, on our side, we still find these phrases offensive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jihad.
It's hopeless. No. The first thing I would say is the Quran actually doesn't say that. If you read the Quran as a document as a whole, which, how many of you have read the Quran from cover to cover? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's memorized a third of it. So the Quran doesn't say exactly that. What the Quran says is, and you'll be surprised to hear, إن الذين كفروا إن الذين آمنوا والذين هادوا والنصارى والصابئين من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر وعمل صالحا فلهم أجرهم عند ربهم ولا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. So there you have the answer right there. What the Quran says is, surprisingly, as a document that has exclusive truth claims, namely that God is one, that there's a heaven and hell, a day of judgment, etc., and that Muhammad is a messenger of God, it nonetheless says, and this verse is repeated more than once in the Quran, those who believe, Christians, Jews, Sabians, any Sabians in the house? No. Anyone, and it goes on, I'm quoting literally, verbatim, whosoever believes in God and in the last day and does good deeds has nothing to fear for their soul, nor shall they grieve. So it's a surprisingly inclusive theological statement that salvation can be attained by any believer, Christian, Jew, etc. Moses is one of the most common names in Islam, as is Jacob and David and Isaac and Abraham, of course. Islam is not anti-Israelite or anti-Jewish. The verse that you're referring to is in chapter 2 in the Quran, which says that some of the Jews on the Sabbath day engaged in work in which they were explicitly told not to do, referencing Israelite and Jewish history, and so God punished them by making them despised like apes. And so some individuals who are anti-Semitic in the Muslim community, and there are some, I know it's hard to believe, but there are some Muslims who are anti-Semitic, would take that verse and try and, interpret it to say, oh, God turned you into apes, and so you're the descendant of apes. It's an inane reading of the verse. It doesn't hold up. It's not what the verse says. It's, interpreted in a way that reflects the lens of the one who is approaching the text and the hatred that that person has towards the Jewish people, something that is against my faith and something that I speak against. The verse, to answer your question in a more general sense, though, there are verses in each of our texts, and I think whether it's the Amalek, the verses in the Hebrew Bible, or the Christian text, you might, they're fewer, but there might be some problematic texts even in the gospel, in the Christian, the New Testament. We each have difficult passages, and it's a legitimate question to ask: how do we read those difficult passages, whether it's with regarding the treatment of women or peace and war and conflict resolution, et cetera. And that's a legitimate challenge, something that we're facing head on at the seminary that I founded in Claremont School of Theology, Claremont Lincoln University, Bayan College. So it's a great question and something that I'm very hopeful about, that as a Muslim community, we're going through a reformation. We don't have a hierarchical structure per se, but there is an attempt to approach the Quranic text in a way that holds at the core the moral teachings of religion and brings out the best of the faith.
Thank you, Jihad. Another question. Let me see if there's people on the side that are asking, because I've been just focusing on the middle of the room. Any extremists on either side? Yes, please, over here. Yes, sir, right there.
You know, here in the States, I think we get a sense of whether you're conservative, you're liberal, because of the way our society's set up. Everybody's voice is heard. And right now it seems that, at least from my naive, perhaps, point of view, that in the Arab world and in the Middle East, what you hear is really just about the extremist views. And I'm wondering if the panel would share any thoughts they have about whether or not, A, are there any real moderate views that are out there that have a backing, that have the economic wherewithal to be more understood? Because really, from my point of view, what we hear in the West is the extremism. And I'm hopeful that there is some more moderate Arabic views out there that are getting more support than perhaps we see in the Western press.
Let me answer
John?
briefly that one. Two hopeful answers to your question. Number one is the Arab Spring. I think for the first time in my lifetime, I see coverage of the Arab and Muslim world in a way that reflects what the people actually think, and not just the views of those who are most extreme. And when you see the masses going out in Egypt, you saw Muslims and Christians together in the struggle for the values that they share in common. And when it was time for prayer, the Christians, you saw protecting the Muslims from the the military, Egyptian military. This is, of course, a year ago, before Mubarak was overthrown. So you saw, and you see in still some places, a coming together of various aspects of the community, the masses that really want what human beings want: freedom, hope, justice, economic opportunity, et cetera, dignity. And again, as a person of religion, I want religion to be the main thing, but religion is usually not the most powerful force in society. I hope it will be a force for good, and that's something that we're working on in our projects here local. I think we're each working on that. But the second part that is somewhat hopeful, Arabs only make up 15%, 15% of the Muslim world. 1 out of every 4 people on the planet is a Muslim. So you have other examples, some worse, some better, but you see at least some potential models in Turkey, for example, where there's an Islamic-leaning government, and there's still issues and problems, et cetera, but they're somewhat well-adjusted to Western-style liberal democracy and modernity, et cetera, and Islamic faith. But they're not really a pluralistic society. They're 98% Muslim. Malaysia is another example of a society that's generally rather moderate, and they have their political struggles and whatnot. But there are other examples of Muslim countries where democracy and human rights and values that we share here in the West are held up. And I'm hopeful in some of what can come out of the Arab Spring in the Muslim world.
Thank you, Jihad. Brian?
I would just say that I don't think the goal is moderation, because moderation never carries the day. And if you think about it, in Germany, not many Germans were really Nazis, and yet at the end of the day, they made no difference, because it was the Nazis that carried the day. I think the goal is not so much to be moderate, but to become passionate militants for reconciliation, for peacemaking, to reach out to the other. In our work in Kashmir, early on, we began by meeting with many former militant leaders, people who carried in their hearts the militant ideology. And we found that initially they were quite hostile to the whole idea of reconciliation, but they were curious. And as they became involved in the work of faith-based reconciliation, we saw a tremendous change happen in their hearts. And we saw former militant leaders traveling down to the refugee camps of the Hindu Pandits in Jammu to talk about the need for reconciliation and to be willing to work for the Pandits to come back to the Kashmir Valley because they were needed. That's what we want to work toward. Moderation, I do not believe, is the goal, because moderation never carries the day. No one will die in a ditch for moderation.
Thank you, Brian. Please, Mark.
There's a wonderful program here in Los Angeles, some of you may be aware of, called the Los Angeles International Visitors Council, which hosts visiting delegations from around the world. And somehow over the years, I've become their host when they want to visit a Jewish school or synagogue or institution. And in the past decade, we have hosted professors from Saudi Arabia at Hebrew Union College. Just last week, I had a visiting group of 8 Pakistani imams and educators, also at Hebrew Union College. We've had Malaysian educators, and I will very briefly tell you my favorite story a couple years ago when we had a visiting group from Middle Eastern countries, and I was privileged to host them for a kosher halal dinner at the Jewish Federation. And as we sat down and we were joined by colleagues, one of them turned to me and through the State Department translator said, "Rabbi, you know, what you're saying sounds really wonderful about peace and tolerance and how beautiful Judaism it is, but I've read a book about you on the internet, and it says," and you know, be careful what you read on the internet, of course, and it says that you're all liars and cheats and whatever. And it turns out the book that he referenced was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which sadly is widely distributed around the world, particularly on the internet. And as my face turned from green to purple to blue to red, I thought about how to respond to him through the translator, and I said, you know what? I said, first of all, don't believe everything you read on the internet. Secondly, I said, you know, the book you're reading is a fraud. It was actually created by the Tsar's police in the early 1900s, and it tells a bunch of lies about my faith and my people. It's caused great suffering to Jewish people throughout the decades, and I'm sure I can send you an Arabic refutation of the book, which I didn't know existed at the time, but I went out on a limb. Turns out the Museum of Tolerance, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, has such a document available. I sent it to him. We became sort of friends on the internet. Translation was done by my nephew in Israel, who was a military translator. I also recall that when he asked me a follow-up question, he said, "But Rabbi," you know, he kind of funked and he said, "You know, really, you and I, you know, we're just two people here, and this book is read widely. How can we change things?" And my answer to him and my answer to all of us is, we change hearts and minds one person at a time. And I said, you're in this room, and I'm in this room. We've begun a conversation together. There are other people who here are participating. And that's how sometimes we do this sacred work, one heart, one mind at a time. And we've maintained an interesting correspondence, and he's read the refutation. And he, by the way, is in Iraq, which he called Babylon. And he is hopefully had somewhat of a change of beliefs.
Thank you, Mark. Now I'll take the question from the woman in the middle. Yes, ma'am, please.
Rabbi Diamond, what do you think about what's going on in Israel now with the ultra-Orthodox rabbis making very hateful comments about the Israeli Arabs and not being sanctioned by the government?
It's an important question. I think it's despicable, okay, and should be condemned in the strongest possible language. I would just caution us that not all Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox rabbis think that way, but there are voices. I alluded earlier to the two most infamous examples. There are voices of religious extremism and hatred in all of our faith communities, and we certainly have our share as well. And I condemn that in the strongest possible language. There are some, you know, I see very alarming trends among some of my co-religionists, some of our co-religionists, and it troubles me deeply. I wish I had an easy answer. Frankly, my voice is not one they take very seriously. I'm a conservative rabbi by training, and so I'm not really part of those circles. But I would come back to what Brian said a moment ago. Maybe if moderation will never carry the day, maybe it is trying to convert these folks into a different way. What I always try to remind people is that religious passion needs to translate into religious compassion. Remember the movie, The Passion of the Christ? I mean, Mel Gibson's not here tonight, is he? Just want to make sure. I would say this to him, even if he were here. Notwithstanding that movie and pros and cons of the movie, what I wrote about and what I preach about is that we have to convince people that it's great to have. I'd like to engage in interreligious discussion with people who are religiously passionate. I think we all do. I admire people who take their faith seriously, but I ask them to translate that passion into compassion for all of God's creation. And in some quarters, I see precious little of that among some rabbis and co-religionists. And again, I think this is the kind of dangerous rhetoric and angry and hateful rhetoric that sometimes leads to acts of extremism and violence.
Thank you, Mark. Is there, yes, sir, right there.
I just have one kind of personal question for you, Mosab. And just to understand, comes really from a place of gratitude for what you've done and for what you stand for. But thinking about sacrifice you've made, I'm trying to think of what your last conversation with your father was like.
Well, my father, when he knew about my faith in Christ, he told me, "You will be my son, no matter what." When he knew about my relationship with the Israeli intelligence, he was in a shock. And it was very short conversation. He promised not to disown me when I asked him to disown me, because I knew that's going to be very hard on my family. I was surprised to see on the news that he disowned me. I learned from my agents and from the media. He had to come, I think, face to face with the enemy of shame. And I forgive him for that. Thank you for asking.
Thank you for that very personal response, Mosab. Thank you. Up front, I'm sorry, please, thank you.
When you're talking about tolerance, because we're at the Museum of Tolerance, and we're also talking about reconciliation and love, isn't it kind of important to understand how your interlocutor actually views you? So it's in Islam, tolerance does not mean the same thing that it means to Christians and Jews. And in fact, Christians and Jews are tolerated under Sharia law in an Islamic regime if they consent to pay the jizya, as described in Quran 9:29, and willingly submit to various forms of humiliation, which are really quite extreme. And I see Hassan understands this.
May I urge you towards a question,
Yeah,
please?
the question is, why not tell the truth here?
That's a good question. Fine. How would any of you like to?
Hassan, I'd like you to answer that.
Okay, Mosab?
Well, you put me in a very tough position right now. Speaking of the truth, I think what Middle Easterns need to learn is the truth about the real nature of Islam, rather than creating model images of what Islam could be, or my personal opinion of Islam as a tolerant religion. Islam is not tolerant religion. There are lots of tolerant Muslims, like Brother Jihad here, which I admire and I love unconditionally. But in Islam, there is no tolerance. The tolerant verses in Islam meant for political reasons. Let's put the Quran on the side that we don't understand its language, most of us. Let's put the Islamic ideology on the side as well. Let's look at the life of Muhammad, the behavior of the Prophet of Islam that jihad and the rest of the Muslim world follow. Did he kill? Yes. Did he marry a 9-year-old child? Yes, he did. Did he kill the Jewish community of Khaybar because they did not give him the treasures to fund his military campaigns? And did he sleep with Safiya, the wife of Kinana, the leader of that community, the same night he killed her husband? Yes, he did. So where is the tolerance in that? If this is your highest model, if this is your leader, where is tolerance in that? I understand that you are tolerant. I understand that Muslims are tolerant people because I know my father, I know my family, and I know my people. But the real nature of Islam is evil. And this is based on my perfect knowledge of what Islam is. I was born to speak Arabic. I understand the language of the Quran. I know about the life of Muhammad from the most trusted resources, and I can guarantee you that Muhammad did not tolerate, but he took revenge from anybody who opposed him. These are the facts that we need to tell our people. I want to see what's so-called the Arab Spring in the Middle East. I see people protesting against political regimes. I want to see Middle Easterns protesting against the absolute control of religion, against Islam itself, against Allah himself in the streets. When we see that happening in the Middle East, then we can say that this is a spring. The European Spring was against the control of religion and religious authorities over people's lives. It was not against political systems. And this is what I want to see in the Middle East. And the only way to see this happening, by telling people the truth. Not Americans, not Westerners. I want to tell my people the truth of what Islam is. And I will see them fighting because they don't belong to that religion. They belong to God, the Most High One who created them. Thank you.
Jihad, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond if you'd like, and I'll give any other panel members an opportunity to respond as well.
Where do I begin? Well, first of all, it's interesting that I'm instructed as to what the truth about my religion is from two people who are not Muslim. One who's, didn't raise her hand when I asked if she's read the Quran or, oh, she's one of the four people who raised her hand when she read the Quran, but that she read the Quran. But, these ideas that are leveled against the faith, whether by right-wing blogs, etc., don't reflect the reality as I've seen it, and I've lived all over the Muslim world. I've lived in Iran, I've lived in Saudi Arabia, my wife is from Kashmir, traveled, throughout most of the Muslim world. The first thing about the Prophet Muhammad, there are no references to the incidents that my colleague here referenced in the Quran. There are historical anecdotes that were written hundreds of years after the life of Muhammad by a tribal Arab society that is chauvinistic, and so some of the anecdotes that he attribute to Muhammad, in my view, are spurious, and I don't find them authoritative or authentic, despite claims that that there's perfect knowledge about these things. As a historian, as an academic, I look at history as a lot of his story, and how we know about what happened in the past was an oral tradition before it was a written tradition, and there are many versions of what has occurred, but we don't have these historical records that are dated back to the time of Muhammad. So I don't believe, as a Muslim, in the veracity of some of the things that are attributed to Muhammad, whether in regards to the treatment of women or the marriage of a 9-year-old, etc. That's not in the Quran. The Quran, I believe, is a divinely inspired text, but it's interpreted by, through the lens of human beings, and that it's interpreted by many Muslims who come from tribal societies that have their biases, that have their prejudices, that have their imperfections, and interpret them in ways that I think are false and fallible, and not only for the contemporary age, but throughout all of humanity. I don't believe, as my colleague does here, that what is ultimately in the best interest of humanity, that people rise up against God in the streets. And Arabic, Allah is just the Arabic word for God. God the Creator. I don't think that that's the answer. I think that, 2 weeks ago I was quoted in an article in the Orange County Register, in an article written by Jim Hench, referencing the work that our community is doing with Saddleback Church, an evangelical church in Orange County, with Pastor Rick Warren. And we were characterized by the author of the article as, having been invited there many times and spoken at the church there, and in close conversation and in collaboration with their pastors. We authored a document that identifies that we both believe in one God, that we are commanded to love our neighbor and to love God, and we committed to becoming friends, knowing one another, and working for the common good. When the article came out, almost 500 comments were immediately posted by zealous Christians who were condemning Rick Warren and Saddleback Church for engaging in conversation with Muslims or friendships with Muslims, and suggesting that Rick Warren is going to go to hell, et cetera, et cetera. The comments that were listed there by Muslims in response to the article were in support of the initiative and the effort. So, to characterize Islam as we need to be aware of the dangers of Islam and Muslims, I think is an alarmist point of view that doesn't reflect the reality of the community here in the United States. There are more Muslims in the United States now than I think Jews even. I think 40% of terrorist attacks, potential terrorist attacks that were going to be committed on U.S. soil since 9/11, 40% of them were foiled by tips by the Muslim American community. We, as a community here in the United States, are well integrated and patriotic citizens, and I think we feel completely misunderstood. I think there are terrible cultures and societies that identify themselves as Muslim around the world, and they misunderstand religion. And what I meant by bad religion in my comments was that they understand religion in a bad way and apply it in a bad way, but it's more culture than it is religion, and that religion at its best combats bigotry, narrow-mindedness, and prejudice that's based on whether it's something you read on the internet, whether it's the Protocols of Zion or right-wing, blogs that mischaracterize the Islamic faith. I think the best way to know the practitioners of another faith are to be in relationship with them, to hear from them directly, and to make friendships directly, and to know from them who they are, and to become known for who you are as a person. And I think if we do that as here in our own country, and if we start doing that around the world, then I think we have some cause for optimism. But I think when people have an entrenched, biased, bigoted point of view against religion in general, or against 1/4 of the world's population, then I think that we have a much harder road ahead of us.
I know there's lots of questions. I've been given the here for now, and I thank you for your participation, and I know Fareed wants to wrap it up, and I thank you, the panel members, and Mosab.